from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
The storm is raging. A typhoon has swept over Paul and his companions as they travel from Caesarea to Rome via first a coastal ship and now an Alexandrian grain freighter. A typhoon is a word from the Greek that means the devil's storm. It is a famous storm of ferocity that sweeps out of the Mediterranean from the north, and it is the reason why travel at this time of year in the fall and winter months are considered so hazardous and so deadly that planned or scheduled voyages are shut down or canceled from November 11th to about March 10th. Because of Paul's reference to the fast of the Jews, likely this is about October 5th, at least as the journey has begun, but it has stretched out many days. Because as we read in Acts chapter 27 and verse 9, Luke says, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, so we're now in sometime approaching mid-October, Paul admonished them, saying, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss. Well, we learn from 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 25 that Paul mentions that he had already been shipwrecked 3 times and had spent all night and a day floating in the wreckage on one particular occasion. So he's not speaking as a prophet here, although he will in verse 23, but he's speaking from just experience. He's traveled this area and he knows that travel is canceled this time of year. As the centurion listens to the Apostle Paul and his recommendation, the sailing master or the pilot and the captain decide they would rather move on from the Fair Havens anchorage to Phoenix. So Paul has begun here in Caesarea, traveled to Sidon by coastal ship, traveled up and along the coast, working against the prevailing northwesterly winds as the time of winter is coming upon them, finally to get to Myra, where they transfer there to the Alexandrian grain ship that is going to come from Alexandria here, but due to the prevailing direction of the wind, wouldn't travel directly to Rome, but across the wind or have the wind come from the left up to the north and then work their way over using the various shipping lanes that we spoke about in the previous lesson. They've worked down to the island of Crete with a lot of effort as the wind has been against them, and it's been a very slow and tedious journey. And they've finally gotten under the wind shadow of Crete, and that's allowed them to finally, after a lot of zigzagging, a lot of tacking, a lot of work against the prevailing winds, because even as they get in the wind shadow, that's going to cause the wind to be variable, coming from different directions, different conditions, and just real slow and tedious way to work a sailing ship, especially one that would be a freighter, not near as efficient as, say, a America's Cup sailing ship or boat that we see nowadays. They finally are able to get to Fair Haven, and there they're having this conversation about, look, it's time to call it quits for the winter. However, the harbor is fairly exposed. It's not a great harbor to winter over because even though they have the island to the north of them, if they have a storm that comes in from the northwest, or certainly even possibly as a low moves through, they could still get winds out of the south, stormy winds out of the south. So they want to move on to Phoenix, which is only about 40 miles or less. It's a short little trip, and that's a much better harbor. You could give them some credit for its common sense. After all, it's the sailing master, the pilot, the captain. They know their business. And so they choose to take the risk to go ahead and travel just a little bit further. If they can just get to Phoenix, then they can spend the winter there, according to verse 12. However, they're not able to do that. Verse 14, but before very long there rushed down from the land a violent wind called the Eurakilo, or the typhoon, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. We talked about how the ancient sailing ships couldn't come near as close to into the eye of the wind or the direction of the wind. They had to sail at a much broader angle, and so it would take much more effort to make progress upwind. But this is an expression that means the wind is so strong that they can't even tack against it. If they were to go sideways, which is about the best they could do in those conditions, it certainly would capsize them or broach them on the wave. So all they can do is turn and run with it. The problem is they don't have the room. So here's an example of the wind's blowing. They've got the mainsail furled. They've got the foresail out, but the wind's just snapping it and blowing it, and they're going to run. They're going to run straight downwind. Depending on the hull design and the drag of the mast and how many lines or rigging is up, often ships would even do something called bare pulls, where they would just not have any sails at all, but there is enough stuff up here, masts and rigs and even the furled sails, with so much wind drag that the wind could push the rigging and the hull that it would still run downwind like they had a sail, because the wind was so strong that it could push against that structure. So they're running straight downwind. Now, if they were in the southern Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, there are many places where that's a really good tactic because you have thousands of miles to run, and by that time the storm's going to blow itself out, and yes, you're going to be off course, but all is well. The problem is, as they come out of, look at this next map, as they come out of Fair Havens, they're trying to get to Phoenix, they get blown, the winds from the north, so they get blown south. Now, obviously, all of these routes are certainly estimates. This is the typical ancient seafaring route. But when the storm hits them, it's a guess exactly where it is that they go. So that's a depiction and no more. But if the wind's coming from the north, they're certainly going this way. And they could take a few degrees off. Obviously, they're trying to go west, so it's likely they're angling this way. But the problem is, if you look at the scale of the map, that's about 100 miles, give or take, from where they come out of Fair Havens before they're going to hit the coastline around Cyrene. They don't have the sea room. They can't just run before the wind and wait for the storm to give out. They're going to get washed up on the rocks. Now, at first, you might think, well, that'd be great. They could get to the shore and everybody get out, and boy, aren't you glad that's over. The most hazardous thing to a ship is the shoreline. Now, sailing into a protected harbor and just cruising in and tying up to the wharf and the band's playing and the wives are waving the handkerchiefs, that's great. But if you're coming downwind in a storm against a shoreline and it's not a protected harbor, one, it's unlikely that you're going to make it to actually dry land. Most shorelines have shallow water before you get to the actual dry land, which means the ship that's going to require, depending on its load, if it's loaded with grain, it's going to require 20 to 40 feet of water to even float, which means it's going to hit the bottom before it gets to dry land. And because it's shallow water, it'll drive up a huge surf, powerful waves. It'll be battering against the ship. They won't be able to control it. It's going to skew around sideways after the bow or the front digs in, and the stern's going to get shoved around. Then it's going to get rolled and broken up because it doesn't take a lot of water to drown. If you're 5 foot tall, that would take, let's see, what's the average? 4 foot, about 8 or 9 inches to drown. And when you've got all the powerful waves, and if the shoreline is not just beautiful, pristine tourist beach, if there's rocks and irregularities in the coastline, then you're going to get slammed against it, pounded, and so on. So you're in a situation then where you would have no control of how the ship lands. It's likely going to run aground before it ever gets to dry land. And if the bottom is 20 foot deep, 40 foot deep, somewhere in there, and the ship hits and starts to break apart, then you're going to get dumped out of a ship that is being splintered and disintegrated by these crashing, pounding waves. Just the wave coming over and slamming you against the deck or the mast or part of the ship can kill you. But as it disintegrates the ship, you get to go into water that's at least 10 feet deep, more likely 20 to 40 foot deep is where that ship would run aground. That's plenty of water to drown in. And if it's a gradually sloping shoreline, as is the case around northern Africa in most places, then you're a long ways from the beach. It's a long swim to get into where the dry land is. So they don't have the luxury to just run before the wind, and this is a storm that will last about 2 weeks. And so there's something then that they're going to need to do desperately. So they allow themselves to be driven along. Verse 16 says, "Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control So as they get blown out of Fair Havens, there's a little island right here, a little island that Luke is talking about, that would have provided just a little bit of wind shadow, probably not even a wind shadow. It's a very low island, one that's not even easy to see. It's not like a big mountain or that it's just covered in heavy forest, but it would knock the waves down. It would create a shadow from the waves, a little patch of smooth water. Well, the larger ship is towing its boat behind it. This would be the ship, the boat that they would use. When the big ship comes into the harbor, anchors in the harbor, then the smaller boat would be used to transfer people and cargo from the ship to the shoreline, especially in places if they didn't have a wharf or a pier that the ship could come to, then this was used to go back and forth. So it's being towed behind, which is typical. However, the storm has gotten so violent that this boat behind them has become a liability. Likely it has foundered, that is, it is swamped, the waves is crashing over it, it's filled it full of water, it's getting damaged, it's certainly dragging on the stern of the ship, which would make steering the large ship all but impossible with this sagging weight behind them. So, but with the huge waves and the pitching, there's no practical way to do that with the distances from the water going from the waters above you to the waters, depending on how the stern lifts, the water might suddenly be 20 feet away and then it's 10 feet over you. And it's a great way to get smashed by things in the water. And so there's just no real way to do that. They don't cut it loose. They're not that desperate yet. So when they get to this little patch, because they haven't been running very far, they've just gotten themselves in the grip of this storm. So they take advantage to pull this smaller boat in and get it hoisted up or lifted, and then get it secure to get that out of the way. Also in verse 17, because again, in the open water with the huge waves, with the ship pitching, it would be hard to just stand up, let alone accomplish much. So they've got, probably the wind is still screaming and howling because this little island isn't going to be much. You've got to really zoom in on a map to even see it. But it would provide that short corridor downwind of it, a little flat spot in the water. And so they take advantage to pull in the boat, and then after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship. So this was something that wooden vessels carried. It is made out of wood, and the way that a wooden vessel foundered is if the waves got the ship working and twisting and bending to finally pop a seam on the way those planks or those boards were laid horizontal around the ship, around the frame, and the way they had to be connected and have a caulk material put between them to keep it watertight. Well, if that ship's bending and twisting and being torqued, if those boards pop loose from each other or that caulking pops out of that seam, water comes rushing in, and then they are going to founder, or the boat's going to fill full of water and sink. So one of the typical things that wooden ships carried in those days were these cables or straps to run around the ship, which would be perpendicular or crossways across those timbers, and they could cinch it up and try to hold those timbers together and minimize some of the flexing that was going on that could cause them to break loose or break their seal. So they take the opportunity to get the ship's boat in, to undergird the ship. And then it says, in fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. Syrtis was so well known as a treachery for ships that it became an expression for entering a dangerous place, or being up on the reefs, if you will. And so you have across, they've only got about 100 miles of sea room, but as they're likely at an angle, what they're concerned is right off of this particular coastline, and then in this gulf is a number of shallow places before they ever get to the shoreline. In fact, there's known to be some small little sandbars out here that shift and move and change depending on the latest storm and current. And the sailors know that area. The pilot, that's his job. He's the navigator, if you will, the sailing master. He's the most familiar with the environment and the conditions. And so they understand the risks. So they realize long before they get blown on the actual shoreline, there's some shallow water sandbar types of problems before they get to that. So what they do, Luke says, they let down the sea anchor. Now, a normal anchor is some kind of iron metal hook. There's various designs, but the idea is you let it down and it down to the bottom, and the hook digs into the bottom and holds, and then that anchors the ship or holds the ship in that position. But again, in this region where they are, the water here is quite deep. As we said, the average depth of the Mediterranean is 4,500 feet. The deepest areas, being this way and one back this way, can be almost 16,000 feet deep. So there's no opportunity to lower a regular anchor all the way down and get a hold of the bottom. By the time they got to shallow enough water for an anchor to hold, they're already going to be washed ashore in the sandbars or the treacherous shoreline. So they're going to lower what's called a sea anchor. There are various designs, but the principle is the same. And there are modern sea anchors or sea drogues are designed pretty much like an underwater parachute. It does the same thing. Where a parachute captures the air and lowers whatever's tied to gently down, the sea anchor opens and it captures water. Now, the boat is not anchored firmly to anything, so it is going to move. It's going to drift. And sometimes these are even called drift anchors. Sometimes fishermen will use them. I've used them before when trolling because the boat motor at idle was moving the boat too quickly, and so you throw out one of these plastic, nowadays they're made out of plastic or a kind of nylon, a little parachute out the back, and it drags and it slows the boat way down. So it's often called a drift anchor as well. Well, what this would do in their case, by putting out the sea anchor or a drift anchor, they would throw it off the bow, and then because of the drag in the water, that would, and if it's tied to the front of the boat, it would swing the boat into the waves, and it would drift backwards downwind. There is the option, and some occasions they'll do that off of the stern and allow the boat to drift forward. But normally it's thrown off the front of the boat or off the bow, and so that the bow's pointed into the wind, because the front of the boat is the part that's designed to part the water, to ride over the water. It's the pointy end. In some designs, the stern, it's called a canoe stern, can be designed in the same kind of way, or at least a similar way. But most craft, the bow is the pointy end and the stern is not. So if you got big waves crashing over, you want the front that's designed to go up and over and break the water on both sides and so on. That's what they do. They cast out a sea anchor like this, which swings the bow into the wind and slows down, because prior to that, they're moving at a pretty fast pace, being blown by the wind downwind, just with the pressure of the wind on the rigging and on the hull and etc. So this will slow them down. It puts the bow into the waves, which is the craft's most survivable posture in a vicious storm. This is not an average storm. This is being caught in the middle of a typhoon. Now, typhoons sink modern warships. They are so powerful and they are so massive that modern warships have been sunk in typhoons. So this is an unimaginable horror for those on an ancient wooden sailing ship, a large one as they go, but still nothing like what they're dealing with. Plus, the wooden vessels are having structural issues with the pounding and the twisting that such a violent storm would bring. Here's a photo or an example of a sailboat tied to, or they have deployed the sea anchor. Now here you can tell by the water, we're not talking about a vicious storm, but it does show you that even in moderate conditions with the parachute or the sea anchor out in the water, it's got the front of the boat pointed into the waves and into the wind. And you can tell, even from this photo, the front of the boat's designed to ride up over and part the waves, and it's higher, it's more protected. All of this is sealed and solid. But if you go to the back, if water were to break over the back, it's not as pointed, it's not protected. This is where the cockpit is, this is where the helmsman is, that's all open, and there's the danger of that water going into the cabin. So it's designed for wind and water to go this way. It's not near as good for it to come the other way. And so you can see a picture here of how the sea anchor is helping this craft. So here we are. They've started out again from Caesarea. They've gone up to Sidon. They've gone up around Cyprus, around the coastline, and then they've come down to the island of Crete. And here's that little island that he talks about that they got into the shallow, or got behind Clauda. And this is a map that describes the depth, bathospheric, if I said that correctly, I probably haven't, is a map of the depth of the Mediterranean Sea. And you'll notice out in these basins, for example, this basin is described as 4,900 feet deep. And that's the same color code. So you've got all this deep water. So trying to anchor as they're blown along here is going to be difficult. It is true there's a lighter shade here, but according to the legend, that's still over 3,000 feet deep. To anchor properly, you have to have at a minimum a 45-degree angle, which means even if you went straight down, even if they had an anchor line that was 3,200 feet long, which they wouldn't have, straight down won't do you much good at all. It's got to be at a 45. So you're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 feet of anchor line. Modern ships don't carry that, and they certainly would not. So they're being blown along. And so the next concern that comes up, they put out the sea anchor because what they're worried about is the shallows of Citrus, which now is called Cedra in modern times. And so right in here, there's a possibility for sandbars. And then as they get into this coastline, and then all through here, they've got these shallow spots. Here's the same way of depicting it. Here it's called the Gulf of Sirte, the same name. So as they're being blown along by this wind from the north, you can see where it gets treacherously shallow here, and then out through here are opportunities for that ship to run aground, and that's a considerable distance from the shoreline. There's plenty of water there to drown before you could ever get to the shoreline. And even if you were an accomplished swimmer, swimming in such conditions with this huge waves and the crashing breakers, it's very unlikely that you would be able to survive that. So, a couple of things to note then. The sea anchor is going to slow them down. It's going to put the ship in a more survivable posture in terms of the storm. But we've got, I don't know if you can see this or not, there's a shallow sandbar area, plus you have these that come out from the shoreline. The other advantage that the sea anchor gives them is if they put up a little bit of sail and give the ship just a little bit of driving power. And the estimates in such conditions, you're talking about maybe running a half a mile an hour or a mile an hour. You're not hardly moving, but it's enough that instead of drifting dead downwind, that you can actually start making progress to the west with the combination of the sea anchor and then the angle that you could move toward if you've got just a little bit of sail up. They wouldn't be able to do much in such conditions. So they get the sea anchor out, and they're being driven along. And the reason why we point all that out, because if they're just going to go straight downwind and the wind's out of the north, then they're going to come ashore somewhere in this region. Well, what we're going to read in a couple of paragraphs is when they finally do get to shallow water, they're going to put out anchors, and then they're going to wait for the day, and then they're going to make a run for the shore. They're going to wash up on the island of Malta, which is due west of Crete. As they come out of Crete, there's that little island Clauda. So they're tracking west, even though the wind is coming out of the north, and that's the combination of how they're using the sea anchor, because they are trying to stay off of this hazardous shoreline. I mean, these guys are professionals, and they're handling it as best they can. So they're being driven along. And again, we're guessing at the angle here. You can see what would be likely a very southern drift as they run from the storm, and then as they deploy the sea anchor and begin to work with it, then they have the opportunity to start to drift to the west. So as we keep reading, they're being driven along. Verse 18, the next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. So it's serious enough, this typhoon, that they're throwing the cargo out, which for the sailors, that's why they're there. That's their paycheck. But when it gets down to live or die, all of a sudden the paycheck is not nearly as important. So they begin to throw out the cargo. What they're trying to do is lighten the ship. What's happening is the ship needs to be as buoyant as possible. It needs to ride up over the waves as quickly and as swiftly as it can. Because as a wave comes, the more that it can ride over it, then all that massive energy goes by and underneath. Where the ship is slow to rise and the wave climbs and crashes against it, then it's pounding against that ship. That's going to threaten its structure. They've already got the straps around it. That's going to force a lot more water as water cascades over it and washes all down the decks and any hatches that are open. It's also hazardous to any men on deck because they're going to have to be on deck struggling to steer it, struggling to work with it. And as that water is coming in, it's going to make things more sodden. The boat's going to carry more water. They're going to have a heavier and heavier ship, which means she's going to rise slower and slower to the next wave, which eventually means she'll get pushed down. So they start jettisoning the cargo. Verse 19, and on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. We're really moving now to a level of desperation. Tackle is the language that's used of ships to describe the mast and the yard arms, the sails and the rigging, all the things above deck that hold the sails, that manipulate the sails and allow them to adjust. In modern terms, I guess, it'd be like throwing your engine overboard because that's what the sails are in an ancient sailing vessel. That's the engine. So when you start throwing that overboard, it's pretty serious. Now, they don't throw it all overboard. They're not going to be able to unship the mast, for example, the great mast, the pole that sticks up from the deck up into the air, and that's what the sails and everything is attached to. It's unlikely in such a condition, well, the only way to remove it would be to chop it down with an axe, and in that kind of tossing condition, that would be extremely hazardous because there's no telling where the mast would fall and how it would be dragged and all that goes with that. So they're throwing over most of their gear, but not all of it, because later, when we get to verse 29 or verse 40, when they do see land, it says, and casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. So there's still some rigging in the ship. If you'll forgive me, let me backpedal through some of these slides to get to. So here would be a potential possible, there's some wrecks of these ships have been found. From that, they've been able to deduce some things. That's an interesting word for some reason. They began to figure out some things, and so they were single mast as best as we can tell. And of course, that mast has to be supported. There would have been more rigging than in this picture, which more ropes to hold everything up. And then they would have had something like a bowsprit, it's called nowadays, sticking out the front where the foresail or sail in the front. This would be your main driving sail, and this would be a sail that balances and allows you to steer and works with the rudder and how they're able to control it. So they're throwing out all the tackle. Well, that's going to be all the accessory lines. They may have gone ahead and taken down, because likely when the storm got bad, that's called a yard arm, this horizontal big piece of timber, would have been lowered to the deck anyway to reduce how much weight's way up here to swing around. It's likely down on the deck anyway. That they might have thrown over. If they didn't have a readily available sea anchor, they may have thrown that over with the sail, tied a rope to it, and it becomes a sea anchor. It would have acted as one. That may be what they're using as a sea anchor, but we know for sure they still have the foresail and this piece, because that's what they're going to use, which it won't do as much, but at least it'll allow the ship to run straight downwind or slightly off the wind. It still gives them some control and some option. So they have been riding behind the sea anchor, and they are working their way trying to avoid the shallow spots, and they're somewhere in here getting blown along in this wind. So in verse 19, when they throw the ship's tackle overboard, that's getting pretty desperate. They're not completely powerless, but let's say if it goes dead calm the next day or the storm is over, they would be able to limp along, but it would be very, very slow. They wouldn't be trying to make the original destination. They'd be trying to go downwind to the nearest harbor because it would really be a crippled ship. But this is a matter of survival. Well, verse 20 continues, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. The fact that the storm isn't letting up at all, that it is raging day and night, they haven't seen the sun in days, one, so the storm hasn't abated, and water, the waves build. When the wind first starts blowing, the water doesn't instantly react, it builds, and when the wind stops, it takes the waves a little bit of time to dissipate and for the sea to become calm. The fact that it's just blowing nonstop would have built tremendous waves. Now, it doesn't take a 40-foot wave when you measure from tip to trough becomes 80 feet. I mean, that's massive to a ship of any size. And so the energy, the ferocity, the weight of that kind of crashing water, and as the wind builds like that, the waves would not only get bigger, but they would get steeper. And the steeper the wave, the more treacherous they are. If it's a nice rounded wave, the ship has more time to ride up and over. As it gets steeper, the ship just is overwhelmed. It can't react. It can't float up and over, so it gets pounded and the waves crash, fall on the ship, and that's a lot of weight coming down on the deck and stressing the structure in an entirely different way as well. So it's just bad, and people are giving up. They're realizing they're not going to survive this. It's in that time, in verse 21, that Paul now offers not an opinion, but prophecy. When they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in their midst and he said, men, you ought to have followed my advice. Oh, that's great. Nothing like an I told you so in the worst kind of moment. Well, if that's what Paul is saying, that'd be really odd. It would be really oddly petty for him to act this way when we've not seen this in him at all. He didn't talk that way to the crowd that tried to beat him to death in the street out of the temple. He didn't talk that way to Felix. He didn't talk that way to Festus. He didn't talk that way to Agrippa. He hasn't talked about how unfair he's been treated or how nobody cares or nobody listens. He's always talked about the Lord. So it'd be an odd thing for Paul to get petty now. Well, it doesn't seem that Paul's intent is to say, nah, you should have listened to me, but rather to say, okay, you didn't listen to me, so we're in a bind, so you really need to listen to me now. So it's more of the prerequisite for why they need to listen. Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. It was only going to be a short trip, and it was a nice, gentle little southerly breeze, so all of their evidence said it's going to be fine when Paul said it won't be. Well, now Paul is saying, look, I know all the evidence says this is bad, but let me give you something else. Verse 22, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. So that's encouraging. Nobody's going to die. That's sad because we're going to lose the ship, but it's also a little bit like, how do we lose the ship and not die? Because if the ship goes under them right now, if the ship founders out here in the open sea in all this storm, remember, they don't have life jackets. They don't have a life raft. They don't have a satellite beacon. They don't have a Coast Guard that's going to come rescue them. How do you lose the ship and not die? It would take some kind of miracle. Paul seems to say, I'm glad you noticed that. He says in verse 22, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. How is this possible? For this very night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me. Boy, if you're taking notes, this is a great place to just write Jonah on the side. What a difference. What a vast difference as the two men face a bad storm. Paul says, I belong and I serve him. And the angel's message in verse 24 was, don't be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. So as soon as God had told him, look, you're going to go to Caesar, Paul knows that he can't die here because he hadn't gotten to Caesar yet. But the added grace he mentions, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. So not only is Paul going to survive, but all of his traveling companions will as well. That's why Paul has a calmness. That's why Paul is able to speak at such a time and actually bring encouragement when nobody's eaten. One, If you're not sailors, you are probably sick from all the storm and the motion. Secondly, you are probably so exhausted from the noise and the movement and the effort that you don't want to eat. Thirdly, it's hard to eat when you can't keep the plate in front of you, you can't put a fork in your mouth. Who wants to prepare food? In fact, when they do eat, they're going to eat wheat. Because what are you going to do, cook? How do you prepare food? How do you eat food? How do you catch your food when everything's going crazy? So he says in verse 25, "Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told." This isn't Paul's opinion. Isn't Paul saying, look, disregard everything you know, listen to me. He's saying, I know what it looks like, but let me tell you about my God. The difference is that Paul is looking to God and not to the storm. The storm is real. It's a typhoon. It's a devil storm. But the devil's no match for God. If God says it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. Not a problem at all. So interesting, compared to the disciples being with Jesus in the storm and waking him up, and don't you care that we're perishing because the boat's filling full of water? And Jesus says, be still, and he calms the storm. Paul is calm because he has the assurances of God. Now, he's been told they'll lose the ship. Well, that can't be convenient. That doesn't mean that God protecting them is going to be easy or that it's going to be comfortable, because somehow they're going to have to lose the ship but not their lives. Sounds like there still may be a lot of effort and a lot of discomfort involved, and there will be. And he has this information. Finally, verse 26, "But we must run aground on a certain island." Not just will run aground, that's what they've been trying to avoid. To run aground is to die. But they'll run aground on a certain island, on an island that God has chosen. It won't be accidental, it won't be circumstantial, that it will be an island that God has chosen, and they will do so in a way the ship will be lost, but they will be saved. Well, the next paragraph continues with, "On the 14th day," they've been in the clutches of the devil's storm or of the typhoon for 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a long time to go in terror. 2 weeks is a long time to go without being able to eat regularly. Imagine the exhaustion and the weakness and just the numbness from the noise and the movement and the fear and the despair and all that's going to happen. So there's another plot or two that's going to be known to Paul, but they are on their way to a safe landing on a certain island that we'll continue with in the very next paragraph, beginning in verse 27.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive.